Today I'm really pleased to that Giana Amador is going to talk. Unfortunately, she could not visit campus in real time, so we have her here on Zoom video. So Giana has a Bachelor of Science, Environmental Economics and Policy, and in Society and the Environment from UC Berkeley. At UC Berkeley, she worked on research around green and industrial policy, specifically studying state and international renewable energy transitions at the Berkeley Roundtable for International Economy and the American Jobs Project. Then before she began working at Carbon 180, where she is now, she worked on sustainable development with a focus on energy access and food security in Nicaragua. Giana Amador is a co-founder and managing director at Carbon 180. At this organization, she wears many hats, from guiding the team's strategy and communications to more recently building out the organization's agricultural policy program. In all her work, Giana is focused on connecting economic development, social justice, and climate action. Her past research focused on the political economy of climate change with an emphasis on green industrial policy and coalition building. So before I hand it over to Giana, if you have any questions, please hit the Q&A question button on the bottom of your screens. And Giana said she's going to stop the seminar at various points and ask for questions. So to ask a question, just hit the Q&A. Okay, thank you. And Giana, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter and the rest of the Cornell folks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you guys about my work on climate change and specifically carbon removal. I'm going to take a moment just now to share my screen with you. So hopefully now you can all see the slides. Today I'll be chatting with you guys about my work at Carbon 180 and specifically the science, economics, and policy of carbon removal solutions. These are solutions that can actively capture carbon from the air and store it and able to help fight climate change. I'll share a little bit more about why carbon removal solutions are important to our climate goals, what the solutions are, where they are in terms of being ready along the sort of technology readiness curve, as well as get into a little bit of how we bring these solutions to scale, specifically thinking about the US federal government and the tools that the government has using various policy levers to bring these solutions to scale and help realize our climate goals. Like Peter said, I'll be taking questions throughout this presentation, so feel free to just throw those questions into the question feature, and then I'll stop every 15 minutes or so just to take a look at the questions and answer anything. So getting started, Carbon 180 is a nonprofit organization. We work at the intersection of research, business, and policy to champion carbon removal solutions. And specifically, we were founded under this climate imperative that reducing emissions weren't going to be enough in order to meet our climate goals. So I have on this slide the UNEP emissions gap report that specifically shows our pathway in order to reach our 2°C climate target. And so here we can see sort of the business as usual curve for the emissions that we're producing today or projected to emit in the future. And then we see this red line that really shows the pathway that we need to take for drastic emissions reductions in order to meet our climate goals and really reach net zero right before 2100. But there's sort of this missing piece that when we started Carbon 180, really no one was talking about. And that's not only do we need to reduce those emissions as fast as possible, but we also need to actively capture carbon from the air and store additional carbon through what's called carbon removal or negative emissions technologies. And these solutions are really important because they can help compensate for a delay in climate action and also offset really difficult to decarbonize industries like aviation and shipping. And so you can see here, when we're reaching net zero emissions, we actually still have a chunk of emissions that we're not able to get rid of. And that's those difficult to decarbonize sectors that negative emissions or carbon removal can help compensate for. And a few other things I want to point out. We're really expected to scale these solutions pretty quickly, starting in 2030 and really getting to about 10 gigatons of carbon removal by mid-century and 20 gigatons of carbon removal per year by 2100. And so this is a pretty big shift from where we are now, and something that the climate models say are extremely important in order to meet our climate goals. In addition, when thinking not just about our 2-degree climate goals, but also 1.5 degrees Celsius, the recent report from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the sort of global highest scientific body on climate change, says that in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with limited or no overshoot, we will also need to use carbon removal on the scale of 100 to 1,000 gigatons cumulatively over the 21st century. So this is an amount that's equal to roughly like 2 to 25 times our current global annual emissions. So these models are really assuming that we're going to have a pretty significant wedge of carbon removal in our future in order to meet these climate goals and really protect the world's most vulnerable populations. And while I came to Carbon 180 because I was really interested in sort of this missing part of the climate conversation, and I feel really passionately about fighting climate change, one of the things that I think kept me there was this sort of shift in framework about the way that we think about carbon, and specifically that carbon can be a good thing. It's just sort of in the wrong place today. So carbon really powers our world. It's stored in our forests and our soils, in our oceans, and the problem of climate change is really about releasing that CO2 too significantly into the air, into which it's causing warming. But if we sort of shift this thinking into carbon being a pollutant, we can actually harness that carbon to sort of drive a new economy, switching it from a liability into an asset, from a pollutant to a resource, and from a waste into a value. And by doing so, we can actually envision what we call at Carbon 180 is a new carbon economy. And this is an economy where we have stopped climate change by both reducing emissions and by removing carbon, but also we've created economic prosperity by bolstering our forests, by increasing the carbon levels in our soils to help farmers increase yields and adapt to climate change and things like flood and drought, and also have built new industries around capturing carbon and turning it into valuable products. And this is sort of the vision that has really driven me to focus on carbon removal and think about how we build out this new sector of the economy that actually shifts the way that we think about carbon. And so to just dive a little bit deeper, thinking about what are the solutions today that can actually build that new carbon economy and that can really get us to the 10 to 20 gigatons of CO2 per year that we need in order to meet our climate goals. And again, these solutions are called carbon removal solutions. They have a couple different names, so you'll see them referred to as negative emissions, carbon dioxide removal, greenhouse gas removal, but they all sort of refer to the same bucket of solutions. And these are specifically solutions that can process and capture carbon from the atmosphere and lock it away into solid forms for timescales that are relevant for climate change. So usually that's decades or centuries. And the graphic on the right really lays out the types of solutions in which we can use to capture carbon. So on the left-hand side, there's land-based or natural solutions that use photosynthesis to capture carbon, storing it in biomass, in trees, in our soils and our lands. These solutions at a high level are really low cost. They are really close to be ready to deploy. We've been growing forests for centuries and we know how to do it well, and we know how to do it in order to store the most carbon, but they also are vulnerable to reversal. So we have difficulty keeping the carbon locked in place once it's stored in our ecosystems because there are so many natural fluxes and the land sink as we begin to experience climate impacts like floods and wildfires. Those types of events put this type of carbon at risk. On the right-hand side, there's tech-based carbon removal solutions, which use chemical processes to either mimic photosynthesis or mimic geological processes that capture carbon. So the big solutions here are direct air capture. So these are basically big fans that can capture carbon from the air and turn it into valuable products, as well as a technique called accelerated weathering, which uses minerals that naturally react with CO2. The CO2 binds with the rock and forms new minerals. And then finally, at the intersection of these two types of solutions, we have bioenergy with carbon and capture and storage. So we use biomass, whether that's agricultural residues or forests or other forms of bioenergy. We turn that into electricity or fuels. And then throughout that process, we capture that carbon and store it underground. And so these solutions, in comparison to the land sector, typically are more expensive, much more nascent, and need a lot more research. But the carbon that they store is a lot more durable in those systems and stored over longer periods of time. So that's a lot of information to take in, but we'll I'll highlight some of the important solutions in sort of the next slides and get a little bit more granular, and of course, give you guys the opportunity to ask questions. But I think the big takeaway from this slide is that there are a number of solutions that can really get us to that 10 gigaton per year scale, but not any single one of these solutions can get us there on its own. And so we really need to be thinking about how we can develop these solutions in parallel in order to meet our goals. And I just wanted to ground that sort of 10 gigaton number again in this concept of a new carbon economy. So CO2 management at the scale of 10 to 20 gigatons per year is equivalent basically to that of what we do both in the agriculture, food, and land use sector, but as well as the entire fossil fuel industry today. So what we're really looking at is a pretty significant build out of an industry that actually can sequester carbon at large scale. And that kind of transformation is really sort of hard to fathom, thinking about how we're both going to stop the fossil fuel industry, but also create a new industry that sort of does the opposite, where we, instead of taking carbon from the ground and putting it in the air, we actually take carbon from the air and put it into the ground. And that's the kind of investment and large scale thinking that is really needed to bring these solutions to scale. With that in mind, I just wanted to give sort of a brief overview of where these solutions are today. I've charted sort of roughly where these solutions are on what's called a technology readiness level chart. So TRL is a framework that's used most often by the Department of Energy, and specifically to chart technologies as they move from ideation into commercial deployment. And so we can see sort of very rough ranges of where these technologies are today. So direct air capture, still in the research phase with some demonstration and very early commercial deployment today. Very similar stage for soil carbon sequestration on our ag lands. Some very nascent like biotechnologies land on this side, where solutions that we know a lot more about, like cover cropping, might be farther right on the technology readiness level. This, I think, I wouldn't get too caught up in the details here. I think this is just a really high level of where these solutions are today. And the goal for us is to really move them from left to right and think about how we get them to commercial deployment. And once they're at commercial deployment, how we really get them to that large scale. So I'm just going to pause there and take some questions now. 1 second. Looks like we have 2 questions. All right. So I'm just going to read out the questions. So the first is from Nicholas. It says, where is accelerated weathering technology in the R&D phase? How would that be deployed? Curious geology student asking. Great question. This is a solution where I sort of have the least expertise, but right now, accelerated weathering or enhanced weathering tends to be pretty early in the research phase. there are a couple of demonstration projects. One is actually a direct air capture plus enhanced weathering project in Iceland, where they're actually storing carbon into basalt formations, where then it turns like to stone permanently and stores that CO2. So we're starting to see some initial demonstrations, but I think most of the enhanced weathering research today is still in the lab phase. One of the constraints there is just sort of the sheer scale and energy that's required to capture carbon in mineral form at an accelerated pace. So I hope that gives you a little bit more context, but yeah, definitely not my area of expertise, but much more nascent than some of the other carbon removal solutions. Another question from Nikita: does direct air capture have the chance of harming wildlife like birds? This is a good question. I think from what we've seen from the early commercial deployments is that they have a pretty low risk of harming wildlife, though that's something that I think we're still learning through these early demonstration projects. There, I think, are about 25 projects that are either in development or deployed right now for direct air capture. So a lot of the work is going to be testing what the land footprint is, what are the energy impacts, and what are some of the other like environmental impacts of these solutions. I know the Nature Conservancy is doing a lot of work on this, so hopefully they'll publish some of their results soon. Another question: what challenges has your team come across in pushing for these carbon removal solutions? It's a good question. I think those challenges have sort of shifted over time as we've worked as a nonprofit, but I think right now one of the major barriers is just education. We do a lot of work with members of Congress who are getting up to speed on these solutions and understanding how the federal government can play a role in developing these solutions, understanding the need of what needs to be developed and for what purpose. So a lot of the work that we do is around education and just trying to get folks to understand carbon removal as an important part of the climate equation. What solution, if any, are you most optimistic about? I love this question. I think I'm most optimistic or most personally passionate about soil carbon sequestration and agriculture. I come from a very small farming community in California where farmers are being affected by the current COVID-19 situation. They're facing very low margins generally with volatile agriculture markets and dealing with difficulties with drought and water availability. And so I really am excited both to use soil carbon sequestration as a way to engage farmers on climate change in a way that they traditionally haven't been engaged in many other ways, and in a way that's very solution oriented, but also to help them adapt and to help them be more prosperous and to sort of support the communities that I really care about in both driving climate action, but again, protecting themselves, increasing their yields, and hopefully providing another form of compensation for the ecosystem management that they do. Okay, question from Jacob. Do you think it is possible to transform the massive fossil fuel industry into a carbon capture industry if we could prove to them that there's a market for carbon capture? I think this is a very good but difficult question. The fossil fuel industry obviously has a lot of troubled history that doesn't even sort of touch upon climate change, that has to do with labor practices, environmental justice. And so while I think the people who have the expertise in order to sort of, again, flip that script and put carbon back into the ground really lies in the fossil fuel industry. However, I think we need to make sure that when we're creating policies that we're really able to hold those fossil fuel companies to credible commitments, that this isn't sort of a way for them to prolong emissions, but actually that they make a really credible commitment to putting that carbon back in the ground. So it's something that I would love to see and something that we do work on. We work with a number of progressive fossil fuel companies in our policy work, and engage with them about this big market opportunity. But again, I think we need to make sure that we really have that credible pathway to really quick emissions reductions and really bold carbon removal. I know we have a couple more questions, but I'm going to keep us moving, and then if we have time at the end, I'll definitely make sure to come back to them. But yeah, thanks for all your questions so far. They're really great and right on point. I'm going to share my screen again. All right. So moving on a little bit, and we're actually going to be able to dive more into some of the specific solutions. So hopefully this answers a few more of your questions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the tech-based solutions and specifically direct air capture. So direct air capture, again, is one of the leading tech-based carbon removal solutions. Specifically, the direct air capture means are basically giant fans that suck in air, just ambient air. Then they use a chemical sorbent that absorbs and concentrates the CO2, and then they use electricity and heat to release the CO2 into a pure stream that can be then used for either storage underground or used in valuable products. This process is pretty well proven at this point. Like I said, there are about 25 direct air capture facilities across the world. The one on the right is a shot from Climeworks right outside of Zurich in Switzerland, where they're capturing direct air capture and pumping it into a nearby greenhouse to grow cucumbers and tomatoes for your salad. And while we feel pretty confident that this technology can work, right now the costs are pretty high. So we're seeing costs at around $200 to $300 per ton of CO2, with the opportunity with technology innovation to bring that down to about $100 per ton of CO2. With that being said, there's a really high scale potential for these solutions. It's basically theoretically unlimited. We could build as many direct air capture machines as we wanted to, except for the fact that we're constrained by the energy, heat, and electricity needs that are used to run these direct air capture machines. And in addition, they have pretty significant economic benefits where we can use the CO2 in order to create valuable products. So like I said, once you capture the direct air or the CO2 from the air, we actually have to do something with it in order to really have a climate benefit. And one of those things is to actually utilize the CO2. And we call this specifically carbon tech. So commercial products that are made with the CO2 emissions captured from power plants, biomass, or specifically direct air capture. And so we take these carbon wastes, we use a number of different conversion processes, and we turn them into a number of different products like building materials, whether that's concretes or steel or carbon fiber, plastics, fuels, and even some of the food that we eat. So using that CO2 as a building block, we're actually able to create a number of products that are currently created from fossil-derived CO2. And these solutions together actually have an extremely large market size. So Carbon 180 did this analysis about a year and a half ago, where we estimated the total available market size for building materials, fuels, plastics, chemicals, basically any of the products that can be made out of CO2. And we found that there was a $6 trillion available market size for products made from CO2 globally, and about a $1 trillion market size domestically. And so this is a huge opportunity that, if done right, if we invest in these technologies, that the world can sort of offset all of these emissions that are coming right now from fossil derived and replace them with carbon sourced from direct air capture. In addition to just being a pretty significant market size, these products also have a fairly significant carbon potential. Not all of them are carbon negative or actually carbon removal. Some of them are just neutral. So for example, with fuels, while they have a significant climate benefit when we're offsetting traditional fuels, they're not permanent storage. When you burn the gasoline that is made from CO2 from direct air capture, in your car, it's released back into the atmosphere, but that's still a net zero process. Whereas some of these products, like storing carbon in aggregates or concretes, like building materials, we're actually able to have sort of a double carbon benefit where we're offsetting very high emissions industries like the cement industry and construction materials used for buildings, but also able to store that carbon into products. So this graphic is from the University of Michigan and their global roadmap of CO2 utilization technologies. And they found that carbon tech products could offset as much as 10% of global emissions by 2030. And with all of that being said, 10% of global emissions is pretty significant, but really in order to meet that big carbon removal scale potential that we talked about at the beginning, we're really going to actually have to pair direct air capture with geologic storage. And geologic storage is where we inject carbon dioxide. It's usually in what we call a supercritical fluid underground from these direct air capture machines into deep subsurface rock formations where it can be stored for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the US has a pretty significant underground geology that's well suited for this. And the USGS estimates that about 3,000 gigatons of CO2 can be safely stored within the US, which is much more than we'll sort of need in order to meet our climate goals. And so just to summarize, I know we didn't get super deep into all of the carbon removal solutions, but the tech-based solutions sort of have a number of different commonalities. So one, they have a theoretically unlimited scale potential. There's significant business opportunity. They're highly centralized projects with really durable carbon. But on the other hand, they have pretty high costs. They require significant investment and upfront infrastructure in order to make these projects possible. And we also need new markets to really encourage permanent carbon storage rather than just those neutral processes that we're seeing today. So that's sort of a summary of the text-based solutions at a really high level. Again, I'm going to pause here for questions. So if you have any, just feel free to drop them into the chat. Great. All right, we have a question that says, when these products made from CO2 degrade, won't that release CO2 back into the atmosphere? How is it then a durable solution? It's a really good question. Again, this is really determined on the type of product that we're talking about. Things like cements and building materials have very long lives on hundreds of year timescales. So those solutions are actually pretty durable in terms of the type of carbon storage that we need to benefit the climate. Hopefully also we would see the recycling of these solutions. So cement or carbon fibers or things like that that are long-lived, we would see those recycled and able to be used again and again. Things like plastics and chemicals and fuels, those aren't durable solutions. But like I said, they are carbon neutral processes and they are offsetting fossil derived versions of those products today. So there is a climate benefit, although it's not explicit carbon removal. I'll just add that these sort of climate or carbon neutral products today can provide important stepping stones in order to get to that geologic storage in the future. So a lot of the direct air capture companies right now are partnering with other people to make fuels, to make plastics, to make these short-lived products. And that gives them enough capital to continue to scale and improve their technology to the point in which we can then store it underground because it's at low enough cost. So I really see those as stepping stone technologies, even if they're not sort of a long-term climate solution. What are the main challenges in reducing the cost of direct air capture? So for direct air capture, a lot of the cost comes from both the sorbent technology, so the chemical that's used to capture carbon dioxide, as well as the energy requirements in order to run the process. So those are two big areas in which we can reduce the cost. The ambient air, or the concentration of CO2 in the ambient air, is about 0.04%, which is extremely dilute, and because of that, it makes the capture process really difficult. So the more we can improve the capture process, and specifically the sorbent technology, we're going to be able to bring those costs down. What will the impact of text-based solutions be for workers? Has there been research into employment and jobs benefits? Great question. To my knowledge, there hasn't really been research in this area, though it's something that people talk about a lot. I think it's something that is a huge gap in this space, and Carbon 180 specifically is going to be doing a lot of work with frontline communities and labor organizations to understand if these solutions are going to be deployed in these areas, how do we deploy them in a way that actually has the most benefit for these workers, while also creating really high quality long-term jobs, not just temporary ones that don't pay very well. So it's something that we're actively working on. And I know a number of other organizations are trying to run these analyses as well. Okay, are all direct air capture sites created equal? That is, do we need to think about where on the globe we position such facilities, or is global circulation sufficient to spread out the carbon removal throughout the atmosphere? Good question. One, carbon can be removed anywhere and will have the same climate impact. The Earth will naturally have fluxes from the ocean and the biosphere in order to compensate for any carbon that's being removed from the atmosphere. That being said, not all direct air capture sites are created equal. We really need to think about pairing direct air capture facilities with the end use of CO2. So making sure that we're reducing the amount of distance that we need to move the CO2. So if it's to an underground injection well, it's placing that CO2 where there's a lot of geologic storage potential. If it's turning it into building materials, then it's placing it near those facilities. And then again, I think there's this sort of jobs or environmental justice benefit of how do we make sure that the solutions, when they're implemented, actually benefit the communities that they're in. And that's a question that, again, needs more work, but means that we need to be really careful when we're citing these solutions. Okay, another question, how do you think the current pandemic will impact the advancement of carbon removal solutions? I think it's really early to tell what the impacts of the global health crisis will be on carbon removal solutions. I think on one hand, the global health crisis will require a significant amount of resources from the federal government, and rightfully so. But because of that, I think we'll see significantly less investment in climate technologies overall, as well as a greater focus on, after we solve the global health crisis, I think there'll be a lot more focus on how do we revitalize the economy. And so a lot of that focus will be, again, supporting small businesses and supporting the industries that are most hurt by COVID-19. And so a lot of that, I think, will sort of shift attention away from climate action. Again, rightfully so. I think this is a much more near-term and pressing thing for the federal government to be focusing on, but it will, I think, in some ways delay action. That being said, and I'm happy to talk about this more when we get into some of the policy details, but there is an active process to talk about what comes into recovery and stimulus packages. And so there might be areas of overlap where investment from the federal government could provide an economic benefit, support workers, but also overlap with carbon removal in a way that would sort of advance some of these goals. And now, just to keep us moving, again, I'm gonna go back to the slides, but I'll try to answer some of the additional questions as we keep going. All right, onto land-based solutions. I just want to start off by saying that the land sector is already an extremely powerful tool to remove carbon. The US land sector today captures and stores about 3/4 of a gigaton of CO2 each year, which is equivalent to 11% of the total US annual GHG emissions. So I think the goal here is really to think about how we protect that carbon that's already stored in our sink and also maximize its potential so that we can store even more. So this is just a brief outline of the natural climate solutions. Land-based carbon removal solutions are often called natural climate solutions, and they sort of fall into three big categories. One is protect from loss. So how do we protect the existing sink? Two is improving management in order to increase carbon. And then three is restoring native cover, whether that's forest, wetlands, grasslands, but really returning them back to their original condition. So now I'm just going to walk through some of those solutions specifically. At Carbon 180, we focus much more heavily on the improved management and restore native cover piece, just because a lot of organizations already focus on avoiding deforestation and avoiding conversion. So starting with forests, again, I'm sure everyone is familiar with forest impact on the climate, but using photosynthesis, trees store carbon in their biomass and soils. This is an extremely low-cost solution, ranging from $5 to $50 per ton of CO2. It has a fairly significant scale potential. We're looking at about a half a gigaton per year of CO2 with existing technologies and pretty conservative land assumptions. It's a very well-developed technology with a lot of co-benefits like biodiversity, water filtration, recreation. Everyone loves forests. They do many great things for us in addition to being helpful for the climate. And they have, a fairly medium durability. Sustaining carbon storage can be difficult with competition for land, saturation, and increased wildfire risk. That being said, those are all things that we can manage for, but it's just something to think about as we're scaling these solutions. And then I just wanted to take a moment to talk through the different forest approaches. I think oftentimes we think about forests and our national parks, in our protected wildlife areas, but really forest approaches can be implemented across many different sectors of the economy. So we have reforestation and restocking. That's what's happening in sort of these natural habitats. Silvopasture is the planting of trees on grasslands, often where we're grazing animals for food. Cropland agroforestry, where we're planting forests on cropland as windbreaks to help prevent soil erosion. And then finally, planting trees in our cities and urban areas. And then one other note on forestry approaches is that over the last decade, there's been a lot of innovation around what's called harvested wood products. And these are products like cross-laminated timber, plywood, fiberboard, all products that we make from managed forests that aren't the natural forest, but ones that we plant specifically for use. And these types of products provide a really unique opportunity to pair forestry with a really strong business case. So back to that market sizing report that Carbon 180 did about a year and a half ago, we estimated that there's about a 12.5 billion domestic market size for harvested wood products. These products offer really long-term carbon storage and can be used in very large buildings. The building on the right is a building in Amsterdam. It's the largest wood-based residential building in the world. It's about 20 stories tall, but really we've seen a lot of advancements in these products to reduce fire risk in buildings, and also increase strength and reduce the labor costs that come with building with wood by just using these sort of new types of wood products. And they also offset carbon intensive steel and concrete that's used for building, which currently account for about 11% of global emissions. So this is a really big opportunity that we can pair with natural reforestation or natural habitats, and also increase the carbon storage potential. Moving on from forests, agriculture or soil carbon storage can be a significant sink. So similar to forests, plants use photosynthesis to capture carbon from the air. They then move that carbon below ground where soil microbes process the carbon and store it over pretty long or significant timescales. And that carbon in the soil actually makes the soils healthier. It can increase yields. It can increase the plant's ability to access nutrients. It improves the soil's water filtration. So really carbon-rich soils are really healthy soils that can support farming and support all different types of plant growth. So it's something that can sort of be a win-win on multiple levels. On the right-hand side, I've started to list some agriculture management practices for soil carbon storage that sort of revolve around two principles. One is minimizing soil disturbance and erosion as much as possible. So these are things like low and no-till agriculture, cover cropping, and then sort of the other dimension is sort of adding organic matter or adding diversity into these crop systems in order to increase the amount of carbon or nutrients that are stored in the soils. And like forests, agriculture is a pretty low cost solution. We see ranges from $10 to $50 per ton of CO2 with a little bit less of a scale potential, about 1/4 of a gigaton of CO2 per year. Again, that's with existing technology and pretty conservative land assumptions. These solutions are a little bit less mature than forestry. A lot of additional research is needed to demonstrate and understand carbon storage practices across different ecosystems, but especially in dryland ecosystems. And we also need improvements in the way that we monitor and verify the carbon that's being stored over long periods of time without being very invasive to the farmers who are implementing these practices. Like I've mentioned before, these solutions come with a number of co-benefits, like increased farm resilience to drought and floods, increased yields, improved forage for livestock when we're implementing these solutions on grasslands, as well as reduced inputs. And then again, similar to forests, they have about a medium durability. Sustaining the carbon storage can be difficult if there's a management change on the farm or if there's competition from land from like encroaching urban areas. So these are just things that we need to manage and make sure that when we're implementing incentives for practice change, that we do so in a way that creates that incentive over long periods of time. And then the last thing I'll say is just that there are folks who are working on developing agricultural crops that have deeper and larger root systems that produce more suberin, which help the root systems resist decomposition and store carbon over longer periods of time, and also converting annual crops like corn and wheat into perennials. And so all of these sort of numbers are contingent on just regular management changes that farmers are able to implement today, but breakthroughs in ag tech could really change that scale potential and make agriculture even a bigger potential carbon sink. So just to summarize the land-based solutions, these are solutions that have pretty significant scale potential at very low cost with a number of other benefits like economic benefits, ecosystem benefits, as well as climate adaptation benefits. But ensuring long-term durable carbon storage can be difficult, and there's still significant research that needs to be done to understand practices over geographies. Another challenge that we see with land-based solutions is just the sort of sheer scale and number of actors that need to change in order to really realize those scale potentials. So in addition to thinking about how we reduce costs and how we incentivize change, we also need to be thinking about the cultural and educational barriers that come with deployment. So with that in mind, I'm just going to pause again and give folks an opportunity to ask questions about the land-based solutions. Okay, we have a question from Marco that said, how would a balance between agricultural lands being used for only carbon sequestration versus cropland be established? What would happen if farmers do not see the benefit of losing cropland? This is a good question. The idea is we want to implement solutions in partnership and at the same time as like we grow food. So a lot of these management practices are ways that we can adapt our farming mechanisms, and farmers can adapt their operations in order to store more carbon in the soil without losing valuable land to farm. So the idea is we like keep farm yields the same and also store carbon. That being said, some of the practices like agroforestry, or some of the forestry approaches where folks are looking to actually convert farming land into forests or into carbon storing ecosystems, that becomes a lot more difficult. And really what it takes is like providing farmers enough of an incentive in order to shift their practices, to shift their operations away from farming completely. There's a program at the federal government called the Conservation Reserve Program, and it basically encourages, or like it pays farmers in order to transition their operations from ag lands into other types of ecosystems. And it has been a pretty successful program, and there are farmers who aren't making a lot of money and they're willing to transition their operations into natural ecosystems. But again, the idea is to try to find those synergies where we're able to both have functioning agricultural lands and maintain yields while also storing carbon in the soils. What can be done to make carbon storage durability in agriculture move from medium to high? I think one thing we can do is increase the amount of research and knowledge that we have about soil carbon dynamics. This is still a space where we're learning a lot, and specifically around the way microbes function in the soil and the way microbes are connected to soil carbon sequestration is still something that needs a lot of research, especially when you think about the variability, even just within the United States, of soil type, operation type, crop type, precipitation, climate. All of those things affect soil carbon storage. So one of the things we can do is just equip ourselves with more research so that we can build models that can actually say, if you implement a certain practice here, you'll get X carbon outcome. And we're really not at that point yet today. That being said, there will always be a risk for reversal in land-based solutions. And what we need to do is just be able to like manage for those reversals at a large scale. So if we're paying someone to implement a carbon storing practices and we pay them for that carbon, we need to make sure that we have a mechanism in place that either ensures that they keep that carbon stored or we get that money back. And it's all about just making sure that the incentives are aligned. Are there crops which are widely grown today, such as soybeans or corn, particularly good at storing carbon, or will we need to find new agricultural staples which are better for carbon capture practices? This is kind of a tricky question. So there isn't really an agricultural crop today that is better at storing carbon than others, though the use of specific practices and specifically increasing the diversity of types of crop on a single operation can increase carbon storage, as well as the implementation of like cover crops or crops that you don't specifically like end up eating, but are still implemented as crops on the farm, can increase carbon storage. That being said, in that sort of ag tech space, there are folks who are working on finding different sort of varieties of, let's say, grains or staples that aren't traditionally eaten. For example, the one that gets used a lot is kernza. It's like a wheat variety that isn't traditionally farmed in the US, but has really deep roots that can store a lot of carbon. So we might see some replacements like that, where we're able to sort of shift towards a different variety of these staple crops that actually store more carbon. And then the last question I'll take on this end is, how are land-based solutions expected to be implemented on a large scale? This is a difficult question that people are still figuring out. Again, I think it's about putting the right incentives in place. So for forestry, it's really about creating a market incentive for foresters to both reforest land that has been cut down, but also to maintain forests and have the funding to do that. a lot of our public forests in the US are funded through or are managed through the US Forest Service, which has been a significantly underfunded program within the USDA. So forestry solutions, I think, are about providing the private incentive for, or the incentive for private foresters while also funding the public foresters to maintain that carbon storage. And then on the agriculture side, I think we have a little bit farther to go, but a lot of what needs to be done is increasing access to technical assistance for farmers to understand how to implement those practices onto their operations and understand what it means for their yields, their costs, their bottom line, and then also, again, provide them with an incentive for that carbon storage, or at least financing support for some of the practice implementation changes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to policy. All right, sharing screen again. So we're running a little bit low on time, so I might breeze through some of these slides, but again, if there are questions, I'm always happy to go back through them. So now that you sort of have a sense of what these solutions are, I think the big question is how we bring these solutions to scale. And as I mentioned, the barriers that these solutions face are high cost, social and environmental impacts, as well as science risk. And one of the main levers that we can pull, and one of the ones that I focus on most in my work, is specifically policy. Let's skip through these. So getting to scale, there are a couple of different theories about the ways that we bring technologies to scale, and again, bring them across that technology readiness curve. So this is one of the theories, and specifically this theory is based around clean energy policy roadmaps, but I think it really applies to carbon removal solutions as well. So when we have very new and nascent solutions, we give them basic research funding, then they move to demonstration projects, we see early stage technology deployment, and then mature technology deployment. And we like to think about where solutions are in each of these stages and how we can move them across this curve using different policy levers. And I think a really good example of seeing this in action is solar. So in the 70s, solar cost more than $70 per watt. And now we're seeing solar prices more around 70 cents a watt or even less than that. And there were a number of policy mechanisms that really got us to that price decline. So in the beginning, there were some regulatory shifts with PURPA that allowed solar energy to sort of compete more fairly on markets. The Sunshot program at the DOE was started to do a lot of basic applied research funding. There was the production and investment tax credit. And so all of these policy mechanisms together really created this cost decline that really also coincides with the scale or level of deployment. So this is what we call a technology learning curve. And really what we're trying to do at Carbon 180 is move these carbon removal solutions across this curve. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. And I like to think of policy levers in sort of three big buckets. So RD&D, research, development, and demonstration, which develops and tests new technologies. Incentives, which encourages private sector deployment through tax credits or other market mechanisms. And then finally, through infrastructure supporting deployment by creating shared resources. So I'll go through each of those categories and talk a little bit more about what that means specifically for carbon removal. So in terms of RD&D needs, the National Academies of Sciences, which is sort of the biggest science agency within the federal government, recently came out with a report called Negative Emissions Technologies and Reliable Sequestration, a research agenda. And so what they did is they specifically looked at each of these carbon removal solutions, assess their scale, assess their cost, assess their current maturity, and then planned research priorities and funding levels to get these solutions to scale. And so they estimated that we need, on the scale of hundreds of millions of dollars of funding per year for these solutions over the next decade, which is very different from where we are today. So I've outlined some of the existing big research funding for different carbon removal solutions. So over the past decade, there's been $11.5 million in funding for direct air capture, which just increased actually in the FY20 budget to $40 million for negative emissions technologies, with at least $15 million for direct air capture, and as well as $21 million for carbon tech. So we're seeing significant increases in the scale of funding that the federal government's willing to put forward for research and development in these spaces, but still significantly lower than the hundreds of millions that we really need to bring these solutions to scale. On the agriculture side, there's $45 million at the Agriculture Research Service to explore the connection between climate change and agriculture, as well as $36 million at the DOE for some of the ag tech research about growing crops with deeper roots. And then finally, at the US Forest Service, about $6.6 million to look into improved forest management and wood utilization. And then in this bottom line, from the DoD, there's about $8 million for direct air capture to fuels. Again, just increased this last year in the fiscal year 2020 budget. On the incentive sides, there are really sort of two big incentives, one for the tech sector and one for the land sector. On the tech side, there's 45Q, which is a production tax credit for carbon capture and storage. It applies to sort of all types of carbon capture, but explicitly includes direct air capture, BECCS, and carbon tech. And this provides a price per ton for carbon captured, $50 a ton for capture to geologic storage, and then $35 per ton of CO2 for the beneficial reuse, which could be carbon tech or some other uses. So we're seeing, again, the federal government value those technologies differently based on how permanent their storage is. On the land side, there's a lot less movement or explicit movement in this area, but in 2018, the Farm Bill established soil carbon within some of the existing conservation programs. So specifically, the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Programs. And these are programs that farmers are able to access that provide cost shares and technical assistance in order to make management changes on their operations. So these are programs that farmers already access. They're super oversubscribed. They're very popular. And so by establishing soil carbon explicitly within them, farmers can access that additional expertise in order to change their practices to store more carbon. The 2018 Farm Bill also funded soil health demonstration trials to get at some of those questions of the geographic variability around these practices at different scales. And then finally, around infrastructure, on the tech side, we have the Use It Act, which finances extra CO2 pipeline infrastructure to support the build out of a carbon capture industry. It's a piece of legislation that has been introduced but has not yet been passed. And then on the ag side, there's the NRCS technical assistance. And this again is expertise that farmers can access in order to support practice adoption. It doesn't just apply to carbon storage, but again, it is a important piece of sort of shared knowledge that farmers can access in order to shift their practices. And then there are a number of this, I guess I'll end by saying that carbon removal solutions are very new. It's not even something that I think was on the federal government or many environmental NGOs' radar 5 years ago. And so we're really in the early stage of like building out this industry, building out this sector, and having all of the information we need to bring these solutions to scale. That being said, there's a ton of interest from policymakers, from the 2020 primary candidates, from members of Congress, in introducing legislation and solutions around carbon removal. And a lot of our work at Carbon 180 will focus on making sure that what is introduced is really based in the best available science, and also doing a lot of that like stakeholder engagement and education to make sure that policymakers are equipped with the information they need, and that there is, you know, a slow and steady build of political will around these solutions. And like I mentioned before, I think a lot of that needs to come with additional coalition building, understanding environmental justice concerns, frontline community concerns, as well as understanding some of the labor impacts of these solutions. And then I'll just end with, please get more involved with Carbon 180. We have a weekly newsletter that we sent out that, if you're interested in learning more about these solutions, has a lot of really great information and updates on the field. We're also hiring for, I think, 3 positions right now, and we'll be posting a couple more over the coming weeks. So we're a growing organization. We're really excited about university students and others getting involved. So please get involved in this way, and you're always welcome to reach out to me as well. My email is giana@carbon180.org. And now I will open it up to more questions. All right. Question: which carbon capture and removal solution do you think will be most effective and sustainable in the long run? I'm not going to answer this question in the way that you want. I really want to reinforce that a portfolio of solutions is absolutely critical. I only touched on, like, I think 3 of the big solutions today, but really there's a whole portfolio of solutions. And if we're serious about getting to that 10 to 20 gigaton scale, we need to sort of pursue all of the options. I like to think about this like the way that we think about renewable energy. You put solar where it's sunny and wind where it's windy, and you do the same with carbon removal solutions. And I think one of the really powerful things about carbon removal is that it's so diverse that it really appeals to a lot of different interests. There are folks who are really interested in investing in rural economies, and there are folks who just think, like, technology is really cool. And so I think we're actually limiting the potential that we have by only limiting ourselves to one solution. So again, the portfolio approach is super important. How can we accelerate the process of bringing these carbon capture technologies to larger scale, and how would you address the potential backlash from stakeholders? Again, I think significant funding from the federal government can really make a huge difference in the speed in which we deploy these technologies. I think the way to prevent potential backlash from stakeholders is starting that engagement now. Again, talking with environmental NGOs, environmental justice group, frontline communities, to make sure that they're not just like neutralized and that we're not having any potential backlash from them, but actually that they're actively co-creating these solutions and have a say in which they're deployed in the world. And really, like, getting that buy-in and, like, building that movement of people who see this future and this new vision for the world that doesn't involve, again, taking carbon out of the ground and putting it in the atmosphere, but the other way around. What changed in the last 5 years to create the focus on carbon capture technology? Essentially, why wasn't it on the radar 5 years ago? Did we just assume we wouldn't need to remove carbon? It's a good question. I think part of the shift has come from just the, like, increasing urgency of the climate problem. I think we've seen that climate change is an increasing priority for voters. It's increasing priority for elected officials. There are climate strikes now. I think we're seeing an increase in the climate urgency more generally. And I think especially the IPCC 1.5 degree report really built out the need for carbon removal solutions in a way in which we just didn't have that information before. So the previous IPCC report was the 5th assessment report, and that report very briefly touched on carbon removal. And when it did, it specifically focused on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is a very controversial technology. And so I don't think folks took it super seriously. So I think some of just this, like, additional research that has come out proved the need for carbon removal, and that sort of got more folks on board. Am I optimistic about receiving funding from the federal government to support the carbon capture industry? I am optimistic. We've already started to do that with 45Q and some of the research funding that was passed over the last year. There's, on the tech side, a really big coalition of NGOs, trade associations, and and other industry folks who are pushing for these technologies. So I am optimistic that we'll continue to be able to get policy passed. However, I think we need to move more quickly, and that's where some of this like coalition building and broader stakeholder engagement comes in, is the how do we not just get incremental policy passed, but really do that like transformational change. Someone asked, what's a typical day in the life of Giana? I think a lot of my time is focused on developing policy recommendations as well as circulating those with policymakers. So an example is right now, Carbon 180 is working on a report called Leading with Soils. It sort of details the work that we've done on the ground with farmers in the Rocky Mountain West and translates some of the lessons that we learned with them into federal policy recommendations. So a lot of the work that I did on that was specifically researching the existing policies, understanding how they could be tweaked, and creating sort of a menu of policy options for the federal government. And then now we're creating a plan to circulate those and educate policymakers around what are the opportunities around soil carbon storage, understanding what that means for their districts, and sort of answering the questions that they have. So that's sort of a lens into what I do on the policy side, but it's really about understanding the science, translating that into policy recommendations, and then doing that engagement and education on the Hill. See if I can answer some of the ones from before. Because high cost is a very significant barrier, do you think carbon capture is something that is feasible in regions that are not economically stable? I haven't thought about this before, but I think the high cost, especially for the tech-based solutions, might be a reason for the tech-based solutions to not be viable in areas where there isn't like a ton of extra resources to develop direct air capture machines. That being said, there are a number of countries who are implementing the land-based solutions. I think like 90% of countries' national determined contributions, or NDCs, which basically spell out a country's plan to meet their Paris Agreement goals, included land-based carbon removal solutions. So again, I think this goes to show why the portfolio approach is really important, because it allows countries or regions to like play to their strength and implement the solutions that are the right fit for them. So some countries like China, for example, they've invested a lot in carbon capture technology generally because they have really big research infrastructure and they have the capacity to build large scale projects really quickly. The US is really great at energy research, and so that's where we focused a lot of our efforts. But countries like Brazil, Indonesia, folks who have a lot of experience on the forestry side, I know India on the agriculture side, again, can just play to their strengths and deploy solutions which make sense for their economies. I think this is very similar to the way that economies already invest in the types of industries that work well for them. And I think we probably have time for one more question. Someone asked, how is Carbon 180 connected to the work at ASU? It depends on what work at ASU you're explicitly talking about. So at ASU, there's the Center, I think it's the Center for Negative Emissions, which is a research lab that's specifically focused on direct air capture. More broadly at ASU and with a number of other universities, including Cornell, we're part of a research consortium called the New Carbon Economy Consortium. So it's 14 universities, national labs that have come together to focus on a research agenda around carbon removal. Carbon 180 plays specifically sort of the translation piece and the sort of human capital piece, where we're trying to build the next generation of carbon removal leaders and also translate what's happening in the research labs to the federal government and to businesses so that they can take action. So we work with all of those universities really closely to make sure that we're equipped with the best science, and that we're able to sort of have that cross-pollination between civil society and research. So with that, I think we're pretty much at time, but I want to thank you guys for sitting through this very long talk on carbon removal, especially over video. I'm sure the adjustment to video learning has been challenging, but I hope that this was really interesting for you guys. Again, I'm always happy to answer any more questions that you have. Feel free to email me at Giana, Giana, at carbon180.org.
And thank you very much for coming and giving us a talk. It was very educational, very interesting, and very interactive. So thanks so much.